designer is based in Shanghai. He was woke up yesterday morning in Shanghai, right? And is with us today. We're very grateful to you for that. He's the CEO and founder of Spicy Horse Games. He was the designer for games such as Doom and Quake. You're familiar with them. In 1998, he moved to Electronic Arts, where he's been a creative director on many projects and created, of course, America McGee's Alice, and in 2010, Alice Madness Return, published through Electronic Arts. So today he will be interviewed by Hugh McGee of, how do you pronounce that correctly? Thank you, of USC.
Gentlemen, thank you, University of Lieutenant Hugh, for having me out. When I released the first Alice game over 12 years ago, I actually thought that maybe the Society had a hit out on me. Alice, I think I got through some grapevine or other that this was not an appropriate retelling of her story, but I'm happy to be here today and not dead.
We didn't make any promises.
Oh, okay, well, that's why I'm here, yeah.
So this is the intro to the first game which came out in 2000, right?
1999.
1999, titled American McGee's Alice.
Wake up, Dormy! It's time for the tea party! Hush, the treacle.
I've got one. Why is a raven like a writing desk? Oh dear, oh dear!
We must save Alice!
Wake up, Alice! Wake up!
Mom? Dad?
Alice!
Mom! Father?
I can't see!
Get out, Alice!
Save yourself, Alice! Get out of the house!
Poor dear. After all these years, maybe that old rabbit will bring her around.
Save us, Alice!
So you can see they've come along. Video game, the quality of the complexity of the visuals have come a long way since Space Invader days. So I think I'd like to sort of start off with talking a little bit about the storytelling sort of opportunities that that emerge and appeal to someone like you now that these games can operate in a complex 3D world like that.
Sure. So, as was mentioned, my background was with games like Doom and Quake, which were some of the first 3D action games, which tended to focus mainly on violence, where you and your friends would grab shotguns and shoot each other in the face. And coming out of that, I saw a lot of opportunity for storytelling, but there was also at that time a lot of resistance within the industry towards the idea of using games for story. In fact, there were some very notable quotes from people within the industry saying that story within games was as useful as story within pornography, within a porn film. So when I had my opportunity given to me to make a game of my own, EA gave me this chance. The first thing that I wanted to do was to prove that wrong. And there were plenty of games out there that were beginning to take a stab at really telling story in games, and I felt that when this opportunity came, I wanted to use this technology not only to show we can tell a story, but also to use the technology to render a world that would really show off the fantastic power that you have when you've got a game engine and can create a 3D world from scratch, as opposed to rendering tanks and guns and recreating wars that have already occurred in the real world. So that was a lot of where the inspiration came from.
And how do you feel the response to sort of your approach to being able to tell story versus just action? Like what kind of response did you get?
Well, certainly when the first Alice game was released, it was lauded. It was critically acclaimed. It won awards for its ability to tell a story, and specifically for taking such a well-known literary piece and transforming that into a game and attracting an entire audience of people who loved the Alice stories into playing games. And of course, since then we've seen a lot of games latch onto some of the same storytelling mechanisms and mechanics that we were inventing and creating, like in the Alice games, and several other companies at that time doing the same thing. So now we kind of see a clear dichotomy in the games industry between games that are purely action, again, recreations of wars and violence, and then also there's a whole other sort of level of games that tend to focus on the narrative, and the gaming genres have been split up, and the people who play games split up along those lines. But there's been a pretty tremendous amount of evolution around how we tell stories with game technology over the last 20 years.
And so if you had to pick a couple of the primary differences between the early days of Doom and Quake versus what this kind of stories you can tell now, what were a couple of those points?
Was a CD-ROM driven game that came on 8 different discs because in order to capture all of the pre-rendered cinematics and all of the voiceover acting and things like that, they had to have all of this space. So there were notable exceptions 20 years ago, 15 years ago, but it really has been as the constraints on processing power and storage space have been lifted that we've been able to cram more dense information, animations, voiceover, things like that into games. So
I'm noting now that this page is one CD.
Yeah,
so that seems like a big burden to get up on the couch.
Yeah, CDs are sort of going the way to do it, sure.
I wonder just for, if you could give us sort of a kind of a top level summary view for the layperson of the process of taking a pre-existing world, a little bit of the technical process and the aesthetic process of adapting or extending that world into the game world. I thought while we talked about this, we could show some of your concept art.
Well, the process of developing a game is, I think, most similar in terms of an existing process to that of making a feature film, because we start off oftentimes with a script, a core concept, a story, and then that translates into breaking down the action and the narrative into specific scenes. We work with a group of concept artists, at least I do, very early on to establish the tone for the visuals in the game, and then we also storyboard out a lot of the narrative, the action. In cases like this, you can see the costumes that we're going to put on to the characters. For me, that process, and for this Alice project, both for the first game and also for the second game, the process was one that took many months before we ever began to build anything inside of the computer. For the first game, I think I spent about 6 months writing and developing artwork before we ever engaged the development team to make the game. And for the second game, I actually spent about 1 year. That was also a function of how long it took to take to get the development contract finished. It took over 12 months just to get a deal in place with the publisher. And at the end, that deal was literally almost a foot thick. It was so crazy. But in that time, of course, we had a lot of space in which to work out the narrative and the artwork and do all of that, sort of on paper and put it up on postcards on the walls before we ever began to actually develop the game.
So why Alice then?
So for me, as I mentioned, there was an opportunity while I was an employee at Electronic Arts. They came and said, please go and make a game, come up with something original. And so I began to brainstorm. And I think, as is recorded in this interview in the Carroll Review, I was driving here in California along Highway 1 up near San Francisco, and a song came on, and the word wonder was featured in that song. And somehow, the moment that the word wonder kind of hit my brain, I had this, it felt like an epiphany, this sudden rush of understanding that Alice could become a game. And not only that, but that this sort of dark twist on Alice could be used as a way of telling a story that would transcend her time and sort of bleed into things that are affecting us today in the world that we live in now. And so this all kind of hit in an instant. And I almost felt like it was already finished. I didn't do anything, it was just there. And then, you know, over the years in developing and expanding on this, it's sort of continued in that same feeling that I'm not necessarily creating something. In fact, I'm sort of dusting off a thing that's already there and helping to bring it to life.
But in some sense, though, you've extended the existing world of those heroines to sort of new stories.
Sure. And as you can see in the trailer, it was the intro video for the first game. The first thing that I did in the story was to murder Alice's family and everyone around her. And the reason for that, for me, was very clear, that I wanted to make a distinct break from the reality that we've known. I do care about the past, about her history, about the contents of the book, but at that point, I wanted to branch and to not have to deal with who she was in our reality. I wanted to have a separate reality in which this new story could be told, but told upon a foundation that honored who we knew her and her family to be, and also what was contained in the books.
Can you give folks sort of an overview of the storylines of both the first game?
Sure. So it's actually been developed into 3 pieces. It's a trilogy, and it breaks down primarily around Alice's journey. So in the first game, what she's dealing with are the traumatic emotional repercussions that stem from the death of her family. She doesn't know, and as we saw in the video, we don't really know. We think maybe this cat knocked over the lamp to set fire to the house. We later discover that's not the case, but what she's dealing with in the first game is the emotional repercussions, and actually the major characters, the Mad Hatter and the Dormouse, they all represent emotions that she has yet to deal with. And it's these unresolved emotional issues that have put her in the asylum, as you see in the final frames of that video. So the first game is really about Alice leveraging Wonderland and working with the characters who represent pieces of her psyche to free herself from this asylum. She's under threat of being lobotomized or some equivalent, because I don't think they actually had invented lobotomies yet. But she's going to have to overcome this. And so the theme of the first game is really about psychological triumph. It's her, as an individual, having to free herself psychologically and using Wonderland as that tool. The second game, which is Madness Returns, we released 2 years ago, has to do with her overcoming in the physical space. And so she confronts the person who started that fire, and she gets to the bottom of the story as to why. And so that brings her to the third, in which she's going to combine both the psychological and physical mastery in order to help society and those around her in almost sort of superhero-like way. That all leads into this sort of theme of industrialization and society as we know it today. And in a sense, she's trying to rescue us from the modern world. It's all wrapped up in there, but you have to kind of play through the games to kind of get the details of it.
If you could talk a little more about the sort of the reflection of the industrialization and those kind of motifs that appear throughout the game. I think for a contemporary audience who sees it, we sort of view it from current popular culture viewpoint, where we see this is sort of the Dormouse, we see this dodo, we see sort of steampunkish things, but really it's got this sort of link back to the sort of the industrialization era and the Victorian groups.
So one of the primary themes within all of the games is this idea that Alice, as we knew her originally from the books, is a very imaginative young woman who uses the power of imagination to live out a very interesting and creative life. And one of the themes that's going on within the games is that this sort of power of imagination is being stolen from us all by the industrialization of the world outside. And so when we look at the artwork and we see this mechanization of the characters within Wonderlander, we see that the main, sort of the antagonist is this infernal train that's running through Alice's mind and destroying Wonderland. Actually, what we're trying to allude to there is that this modern society, and specifically what was happening during the Victorian era with the Industrial revolution is the undoing of the imagination. It's why suddenly now we look around and everybody's staring at their cell phones instead of talking to each other. In a sense, all of that is contained within the challenge that she's trying to overcome, especially if we ever get to make the third game. We'll touch on that in a much more solid fashion.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way, you know, in some of the, playing through the game, the idea kind of expresses itself as this kind of corruption of wonder.
Yeah, exactly. And I do personally feel that even though I make games, I think games in many ways take us away from the wonder of the real world and of telling our own stories. I think television does the same thing in some ways. You know, I'm not anti-games or anti-television or anti-entertainment, but at the same time, I think a lot of the conveniences that we've created and a lot of the things that come out of industrialization tend to dilute or numb our own creative abilities. And so that's a very big theme in games.
So, but just to play off that for a second, when you, as you know, the head of a game studio, how do you then inspire that kind of creative engagement with the world of apparel with your team of artists and programmers and designers who are helping you realize the project?
So we have a very heavy focus on quality of life for our employees in our studio, and we force them out into the real world to go to art museums, and we have movie watching parties inside the office, which happen within their work hours, so they're being paid to learn about the world of Western cinema. This is especially important because we're in China, and a significant portion of the people making the games are Chinese, so they don't have that exposure to, you know, what we understand as the Western version of Alice, or even the Disney version. Many of them have never seen the Disney animated feature of Alice, which I consider to be a good thing when they were making the game. But so we actually put a lot of emphasis, and I put a lot of emphasis in our studio on getting away from games, getting back to more traditional media, and trying to expose our staff to things in the real world and to more traditional forms of art.
Yeah, that's another good point, because I think most of us here have some affinity for sort of, you know, Lewis Carroll and Wonderland and Alice, but also for libraries and institutions whose mission it is to make sure that these things are preserved and disseminated and they don't go away. So what sort of avenues for engagement with sort of more traditional media did you sort of distinguish that on?
Well, like I said, we would watch classic films because I wanted them to understand traditional cinematic technique or storytelling techniques. Again, these are programmers. These are guys who grew up wanting to make games, and they never really thought that the tools they were making would be used or necessarily required for telling a cinematic story. So it would be things like that, or taking everyone out to the art museum, or spreading around translated versions of the stories, or dissections of pieces of the story, so that they could really read into and understand what it was that we were building in life.
So when it came to translating, or sort of dealing, not so much translating, but dealing with the sort of the absurdity or sort of the illogical logic of the things at this point.
It's really tough.
Yeah, I was going to say, how does that translate into when you have sort of a language barrier, a cultural barrier, and sort of deadlines?
So surrealism, we found that surrealism in the production of the artwork amongst the Chinese development staff that we had was something that was very difficult. And so we tried to train, but we also would bring in, and I think some of the art you were showing was from different artists who came from different parts of the world to China. A guy from Brazil, lots of guys from Australia, some French guys, some Belgian guys. I mean, we had people from all over the world coming in to work on the project in Shanghai. So it's a much broader topic, but sort of the way in which the Chinese education system works, we instill in conformity, we've also allowed them oftentimes with the freedom of expression that we need to have that kind of sort of expression of art. And again, it was really interesting making this game with the central theme of being robbed of your sort of artistic ability amongst a group of people who are inside of a society that does that to them from the very earliest stages.
And so do you feel that by the time you sort of worked through these projects that you sort of brought people along?
Absolutely.
A little bit of a
journey? Yeah, they got it. And they were really incredibly proud of what they had done because it was the first time that a purely Chinese development company, not a purely Chinese team, but a predominantly Chinese team, had produced a large-scale console game for the Western market from beginning to end within the borders of China. So it was a landmark in that sense, and it was also a landmark in that it also won awards and accolades for the writing and for the artistic expression that's within. They were very happy about that.
I think it might be also sort of instructive to sort of talk a little bit about how you decided, once you sort of decided this world of Alice in Wonderland as the basis for this game project, maybe you could give a little bit of an overview of what the sort of game genre possibilities could have been. This is sort of a third-person action game, for one way, but it could have been a role-playing game, it could have been a first-person game. Like, just maybe talk a little bit about the options that are available to you as sort of a interactive storyteller and why you made the decisions that you did.
So yeah, I think the point is that there are a lot of different game genres, and a lot of times the genre choice will define or dictate where you place the camera. Is it a first-person thing where you're looking over the barrel of your gun, or is it a third-person thing where there's a camera floating behind the character, and a lot of other, obviously pieces that go together with that. But for me and for the Alice stories, those have been always third-person in my mind. We're seeing over the shoulder of the main character, Alice, and it's important because this is her story, and this is her game, as opposed to a game where we might be inviting the player to put themselves into the role of a soldier and look over the sights of that soldier's gun.
So we talked a little bit about sort of story, but I guess there are a couple other sort of major elements as you approach the world of the game, and that's sort of the the imaginative landscape as it sort of manifests, but also the characters. So I wonder if we could maybe just talk about your approach to these, I hate to use the word, but sort of iconic characters that have a sort of built-in opinionated fan base. Sure, but not that I mean that any of you. But sort of your approach to the characters, what you needed to sort of vary from canonical Alice, and how that played out in the sort of imaginative process and the development process. And I'll bring up some of your characters on as well.
Yeah. So this actually could sometimes become a contentious issue when we were making the game, because of course when you're employing a number of really creative individuals to make art, to tell the story, oftentimes they want to put their own fingerprint on what's being created. But I established some rules early on that had to do with how we could adapt and why we would make those decisions. And the first was that we did need to try to be as true as we could to the original stories, to the first two books, and that anything that we saw Alice imagining, because in the game, everything that we have here is taking place within her mind. So anything that's in the game, by definition, had to be something that she would have experienced, read of, or seen in her life. That means we couldn't have a UFO flying around inside of Wonderland, because that would have been our invention. And to support that, myself and our writing group and the artists, we went back and we read a lot of the news from the time. And so we kind of made the assumption that if it was in the news, say that the marriage of the Emperor of Japan being in the Times of London, that Alice might have some way of knowing of that. Therefore, we had an excuse to put an Asian-themed level into the game. And for the adaptation of characters, a lot of times, well, not all, well, a lot of times, most of the time, we make those adaptations with a very specific goal in mind in terms of alluding to something within Alice's psyche or within the larger story. There are so many of those connections, actually I tend to forget all of the ones that we made, but it was very rare that we made a decision for stylizing a character or for a location in the game without some foundation within the broader narrative.
So were there any characters that proved more problematic than others to deal with?
I think Alice has always been the most problematic. Going into the second game, in fact, there were full-on battles within our studio because people who were coming to the production, which was 10 years after the release of the first game, had in their minds ideas about who this character was based on their play of the original game 10 years prior. And so I would be standing there feeling that, in sort of the role of the defender of who I thought this character was, while our art director might have wanted to give her a very short, skirt, or our development director perhaps wanted to make her more overtly violent in some respect in the game than I felt comfortable with. So even, yeah, within our own development team, there were times where these things would come up, and most frequently it was about Alice herself. Even with our publisher, they wanted to try to build a marketing campaign that would have defined her, I can't remember the word they were using, but essentially as a lunatic. There was another word they were trying to use, and I said, no, that sort of disempowers her, takes away from the character her ability to make decisions for herself and for this to be a hero's journey. But they were really bent on, portraying her in this sort of maniac style, and so that became a battle more than a few times.
You mentioned something about sort of seeing yourself as the kind of the protector of the character from the first game, and I think that's sort of illuminating to me, because I think of these as sequels of the Lewis Carroll Alice, but you have this other sort of, you sort of built another little Alice canonical bit there that you have to sort of follow up on. So have you sort of begun to see the first Alice game and the second Alice game as part of the broader sort of Lewis Carroll realm? Do you think people respond to it that way?
I see them that way, but I don't expect that others necessarily have to. But I have to see them that way simply because, as I said, I established a rule internally that there needed to be a clear connection between decisions we made and something in the books to support those decisions. We were not setting out to make extensions to the books, but at the same time, we didn't want to do things that violated the books so terribly that you couldn't feel like they lived within the same universe.
So when you were making these games, did you feel, when you talk about the relationship with the publisher and the marketing, and we'll get to that a little bit later with a fairly dramatic example of that, but did you feel like you were making these games for Lewis Carroll fans or for video game fans, or did you feel like you had somewhere there was this nexus of those group of people?
With the first game, I think I wasn't sure who we were making it for because we weren't sure that there was an audience for it. It was a bit of a gamble, to tell the truth. There were not a lot of games at that time that sort of attempted to do the things we did by way of the action and combining that with the story, and then also taking a well-known classic story and adapting it to a game. I mean, there were a lot of risks in there. But the success of the first game clearly established that there was an audience, and it also clearly introduced me to that audience and formed a connection with them, so that by the time we began to make the second game, because there'd been 10 years in between, I had a very clear understanding of the messages that had resonated, of the things that had really worked for the audience, and then as we were making the second game, I kept those things in mind.
And what were some of those things that really struck the audience about the first game?
Well, one of the things that was really amazing was that the audience ended up dividing 50-50 male-female, and that's very unusual for games. Games are traditionally, predominantly male audience, and you may have a game that sells, 95 or 90% to a male audience and a small percentage to female audience. With the Alice games, we saw immediately that the audience was 50% or more female gamers. And what was really interesting was they were saying it wasn't that they didn't like to play games, it's just no one had made a game that appealed to them before. So, that, I think, realistic portrayal of a female character, and one who had strength, and one who had a leading role in a narrative like this, that really worked. And I had to defend that in the portrayal of her pretty aggressively at times. So that worked. The storytelling worked. One of the assumptions about gamers was that they weren't interested in a literary telling, or that dialogue couldn't be too complex, or that you couldn't put riddles in, and that was all completely wrong. People absolutely loved the multifaceted, layered approach we took to the narrative, to all the Easter eggs that we hid within the world and within the story.
The language is very stylized.
It's very stylized. It's not dumbed down at all. And initially there was a lot of resistance to that. And then we came around where I filled it up with note cards. And each note card was labeled with a specific emotion that we were trying to convey to the player, that we wanted the player to experience. Also the emotion that Alice herself was dealing with, the sort of part of her psyche that we were dealing with. There were multiple layers to each of the cards, and then those Like if you play through the game, you'll see there's a lot of reference to numerology, to alchemy symbols, to the geography and the architecture of maps, all of it relating to either her journey or the internal architecture of her mind, or the relationship these things have to her psyche or to the mystery that she's trying to uncover. So it's a pretty complicated architecture that sort of holds it all together. It's actually something that I would be required to have the big map in front of me to even recall all the details of it.
I mean, it is something of a detective story. She's trying to figure these things out. So were you conscious of sort of those sort of tropes and mechanisms of detective mystery narrative that you were?
Yeah, absolutely. If you play through the second game, you'll see it's a sort of mixed up timeline of various events throughout the course. I don't want to give away too much of it, but it's a year of Alice's life in London after she's outside of the asylum, and it happens in these snapshots. If you've seen the film Memento, it's kind of like that. She doesn't have a clear recollection of what happened, but she's trying to recall not only what's going on within this year in London, but she's also trying to recall events of the past. And this train is moving through her mind, destroying these memories, while she's trying to uncover the truth to this mystery. So it's, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit, we spoke specifically earlier when we were talking about this train, and can you just talk a little bit about some of the specific sort of conceptual elements that went into this illustration?
Yeah, I mean, without giving away who the bad guy is, because there are connections there, but the train, again, as I said, not a lot was done without thinking about why we were doing it. For the design of the train, you can see that there's a Gothic cathedral built into the train, and so the cathedral and the religious theme actually links to the identity of the bad guy at the end of the story. Of course, the train itself, is a good piece to identify with the Industrial Revolution, which was taking place at that time. And this train is going to all the stops within Wonderland and destroying them. And so Alice is sort of trying to play catch up with this as it's moving through her mind and destroying her mind. And so she's finding the various stops along the Wonderland rail line have been destroyed by the train.
Now, we talked a lot about sort of the internal world and the characters and the landscape, but I know that something that pretty much everybody who does anything creative nowadays has to deal with is the instant fan response on the internet. Now, I know that everyone in here is very well informed about their opinions about these things because they know this stuff very well. That's not always so with the commenters and the fans that you'll encounter online. And there was at least a decade that passed between games, and I wonder, and I read the video game blogs, and they're neither excessively informed nor excessively polite. So I'm curious to know if any of that sort of fan interaction, fan response, is in anyhow inform maybe what you did with the second game or what you would do in the third part of the trilogy.
It's funny, the fan response just made me increase the level of mystery that we incorporated into the design and into the development. So it made me realize that one of the reasons why the original game was so enduring, why it lasted for so long, and why people continue to talk about it for so long, was because of this refusal I had for answering any of the questions that people had about, the internal structure of the story.
So was that out of Crowley and whimsy, or just spite?
Well, it was a combination of things. One thing, as I mentioned, was the level of detail that we got into in terms of hiding meaning within the game got to be so great that I have notebooks to keep track of it, but I can't on a sort of normal daily basis keep track of all of it. So a lot of it started off with the first game with me just kind of forgetting it. So my response to them online would be, you'll just have to figure that out on your own. When in fact I was like, I don't know why I did that. And so by the time the second game came along, I realized, well, we need to incorporate even more of that stuff into the game. There needs to be even more symbolism, even more connections between what was happening in her past and what's happening in the future. And so that was one of the things that it taught me, was create more of those questions and answer fewer of them if possible.
And do you feel like that? Sorry.
I said just like Carol.
I mean, do you feel like that had a qualitative impact on the second game?
Absolutely. I mean, the first, well, I can see that the chatter around the two games, it definitely increased with the second game, because there were so many more obvious sort of puzzles being put in front of people, and that really drove them crazy. And so, you know, I think to this day you'll find that globally they're a very active and large community of people who play both games and who love to try to dissect what was going on, and writing fan fiction about what was going on, and I mean, just all kinds of crazy stuff.
So there's fan fiction based on the game stories.
Yep. Fan fiction, cosplay, you know, toy and art creation. I mean, there's a vibrant, very active community of people who, you know, dress up as the characters from the games. You know, in the second game, we had already seen the cosplay happening, so I made a point to.
Does everyone know what cosplay means?
Costume, dressing up in costume.
But in a very serious way.
Very, very serious way. So in the first game, you know, we gave her a dress that's got the blood splatter on it and the alchemy symbols on the pockets, and, you know, of course the iconic now knife from the game. And so many girls have, you know, adapted that and turned that into this costume play. They wear these conventions. That when we made the second game, I made a point of working with our art directors to create a whole line of dresses. So each new place that Alice traveled to in Wonderland inspired a new dress. I think you might have images of those. And this was partly, it made sense internally with the story, because as she went to the Queen's Domain, suddenly she's wearing the dress of the Queen's Domain, and it just worked, and it looked nice. But the other great thing is that now the girls who are cosplaying, who are wearing the costumes, have a range of dresses that they can wear, and they absolutely love that.
I want to get back to the idea of sort of the marketing aspect, because I know to a lot of people who aren't into games and they have this idea of games that they're all about shooting and they're all about aliens. So I want to talk a little bit about, maybe you can sort of tell the story you told me earlier about your approach to the story and the level of sort of darkness and violence, and how the publisher reacted to that. While I move the machine back over, I can show the sort of the publisher's sense of how they would have marketed, or I guess they did market it sort of over your objections. Fair to say. So,
you know, one of the interesting things that's come out of having a game series, that the first one came out in 2000 and the second one was 10 years later, is that we've been able to sort of witness some of the changing within the game publishing industry. Because the first game, and I think someone had a copy of the box, when it first came out, had Alice on the cover with this vorpal blade and some blood splattered on her. And within weeks of the release of that game, because of the perceived level of violence with this blade, the game publisher had to change all the boxes. So she was standing there instead with a wand in her hands. Then you fast forward 10 years later, and this was the first M-rated game, by the way, that Electronic Arts had ever published. And I got a report that at one point the CEO held the game up and said, "This is exactly the kind of game we will not be known for making." Now, of course, these days their entire business is predicated on hyper-violent M-rated games, but My Alice was the first M-rated game that they published. Now, if you were to have it rated again today, I doubt that it would get a teen rating. It's so tame compared to the stuff that's in the market these days. And so fast forward 10 years, we're making the new game, and now the publishers, EA, still coming to us and saying, make it more violent, make it more bloody, show more flesh, you know, take it and push it over the top. And so the dialogue shifted, and now I was defending what we were doing, the artistic, you know, decisions we were making, and trying to say we don't want it to be that violent, we don't want it to be that bloody. And I don't know if I should tell that whole story about, yeah, it's pretty bad. So I got really upset, and I sent them back a picture in response.
The dean is still out of the room, right?
Where I had photoshopped a plastic rubber dildo on top of a snail and sent this back, and I said, you know, if you keep pushing for all this violence and sex and gore in the game, I'm going to convert all the characters in the game to these dildo creatures. So they were really angry, and they stopped communicating with us for a while. And they made these trailers, and they made the trailers outside of our studio and without our input, and the trailers ended up being extremely violent and gory. So I guess we can watch those, but just so you know, this was, I considered, over the top, and this was a part of this battle that we had going with them about this.
Were these trailers released?
Oh yeah, and the trailers were released, and the core fans were really put off by the trailers because they viewed these trailers as a sort of betrayal, you know, that we had turned Alice into this crazy blood, you know, thirsty thing, and they weren't happy about it. And you'll notice, like, her skirt is really short. They portray her as a sort of maniac, and then they've got the bloody blade as a part of the name in the game. I also rejected and resisted that, but you know, at that point they just went ahead and did. So it was really interesting to see the contrast between 10 years ago and today, with the way that the publishers have changed their stance towards violence and blood and gore, where before they were really nervous about it, now they're pushing for it, even in a game where, if you play the game, it's not like that. It's not this sort of over-the-top, super bloody, crazy thing. So it's very interesting to see how it's changed.
What do you find yourself sort of, I mean, there's a huge difference in the sort of the tone and obvious, very literal, you know, violence in that versus the opening cinematic that we saw. So do you find yourself, when you're in the video game world, sort of defending a more subtle approach to storytelling among your peers, maybe not so much among sort of the, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this again goes to what I had said about people being surprised that a literary approach to game storytelling, you know, or writing smart dialogue, or these kinds of things could work, because I think if you go to the marketing departments of the big publishers, they will tell you that no, that's not the audience, and you're not going to. And in fact, the numbers, I think, you know, sustain that argument for them, because you've got billion-dollar franchises that are built atop, running around with guns and shooting each other in the face, and you know, an Alice type of game doesn't make that much money. So, you know, they're going to put their money where they know they're going to get the greatest return. And the fact is that the majority of gamers are, you know, males 18 to 25, and they do like running around shooting each other in the face.
I want to talk a little bit about the future, and if I get this story wrong, you can correct me. Like, you mounted a successful Kickstarter campaign to purchase back the film and animated rights to the narratives based on the first two games, right? And so and plus the Kickstarter campaign also included production.
Yep.
Is that true? And this new project is Alice.
Her last name. But so she'll jump into these people's minds, and her hope is that she can shape and change society. That she can, for instance, inspire Vern in his writing to help guide us in society away from, you know, something damaging towards something more constructive. So that's the story for Otherlands, and we ran a Kickstarter campaign and raised money to create animations based on these explorations of these minds. So right now, I think we're building an animation for Vern, I think one for Thomas Edison, and one more. And those will be released at the end of next year, 2014. And we're also working now on a feature film, which we're going to shoot in China with a very well-known Hong Kong kung fu director, action kung fu director, and that's going to be live action, and we're hoping that would be in production next year. No, it was between San Francisco and I think Monterey. or maybe just black. Yeah, so it might have I have a lot of rocks along there.
Are you an artist as well as a writer, and how do you function as the creator, the team leader of this product?
So my main contribution is in writing, and I have a writing partner who's based in San Francisco. He lives there. His name is R.J. Berg. So if you look at the materials and the games, you'll see he's credited alongside myself for the story, and he writes the dialogue. So I write the larger structure, and like I said, I do these walls full of all the meaning and all the, and then he tries to put all that apart and then write dialogue to fit in with that. And then beyond that, I do sketch, but they're absolutely awful. I'm a terrible artist, but obviously we've got really good artists, so I tend to give them direction and work with them. And on a day-to-day basis, I'm just sort of there, trying to run the studio and keep things going along smoothly. In Shanghai, yeah. It's a mix. So when we built the last game, our internal team was 80 people. We had another 65 people working externally doing 3D art production, and another 20 in various places around the world doing art, sound, and things like that. So it was almost 170 plus people, 165 people. The majority of them were Chinese. That's my company. For that product, yeah, these days we self-publish. You mean the trailer?
Yes.
The trailer was produced by a company in London that does trailer commercials and animations called the director slash called Shy the Sun. I think the animation's beautiful. I just didn't like the content of it. Yeah. Started off great. Went to a bad place.